This film is about my journey in discovering Australia's national identity, specifically through art. What do you think art is?
I don't know, it's an expression of the soul in a physical sense that's, I don't know, it's more than just what you put down on a piece of paper or something that transcends.
It's a hard question.
It's an impossible question that you constantly have to consider at art school, and it's kind of frustrating to be asked. It's sort of anything that anyone has put concept and thought behind.
For me, a way of expressing myself and a way of expressing ideas in the same way anyone else would express it. Is my camera work?
I'd like to say, something overtly earnest, like the pursuit of truth or something like that. But I think it's ultimately about people trying to, make gestures and affect the universe or their lives or society.
And I noticed there's a lot of graffiti everywhere. Would you guys consider that as art?
Some of it.
Yes, I certainly would.
There's a rebellious aspect to it, which, it's just an expression of our freedom of speech, and, it's something that is there for the public to see.
But at the end of the day, what I really react to is like a really good tag on, a black tag on a white window. It's just the most base, immature level of transgression, and it's glorious.
Completely aside from art, do you think Australia has national identity?
Yeah, I think it has several.
I do. I think Australia definitely has a national identity. It's a developing identity.
Australia is so new. Ireland had all this old history, and Australia is sort of like we've only been here for 200 odd years.
Yes, I think the outback, the bush, like kangaroos, koalas, yeah, I think that's what is the Australian identity.
I think the most interesting Australian symbols are the national animals on the kangaroo and the emu, because neither of them walk backwards. So it's really symbolic of Australia never moving backwards but always moving forwards.
For me, I think Australian lifestyle is really distinctive.
Yeah, quite relaxed.
Yeah, very relaxed, and people have time use time.
But people definitely make time
Make
for
time,
relaxing.
yeah.
It's like you've got your broken culture and you've got your sort of sophisticated, I don't want to say private school, but, all sorts of different identities. Plus, Australia is so multicultural that it's difficult to say, yeah, there's a single national identity.
The way that Australia has developed its identity might be through isolation and through a slow interpretation of things that are happening overseas, but that's kind of changing, and I think it's actually muddying the way that Australian art is working.
I was just talking to someone, I was actually trying to get under someone's umbrella, and so I was like, well, I don't know whether they would do that normally to another American, so I just ran under the umbrella. I was like, I just put on this really classic Australian accent, hey mate, do you mind if I just jump under your umbrella for a sec? Yeah. And he was like, oh, you're Australian, oh, this is so great, how are you? Just, let me under the umbrella. I was like, oh yes, so Aussie. But I guess that's sort of a part of the Australian national identity.
And do you think art helps create this identity?
Well, the Australian art helps create this identity because most of Australian artists try and work with Australian landscapes and try and really show what they think Australia is.
Yes, I think it does. I mean, obviously it's sort of a, any kind of discussion where you begin talking about an essential culture of art within Australia, there's sort of not a couple of competing things, but there's obviously the art of Indigenous Australia, which precedes any art produced by any of us by 40,000 years.
But I find maybe like Aboriginal art obviously has a lot to do with Australian identity, but I find contemporary visual artists have very little to do with the identity as a nationality.
I suppose there is a specific niche to this of Australian art, as in like Aboriginal art.
Art enables us to respect or appreciate or come to understand more the Aboriginal attachment and ownership of Australia, because after all they were the caretakers of this land before white people.
So do you think Aboriginal art should identify the national identity?
I think it's definitely a very important niche in Australian art and therefore Australian identity, but I don't think it is representative of Australia's entire identity as far as art goes.
It's tricky for someone like me to be able to comment on the Aborigines, because we feel like it's not as if we feel completely separate to them. Like we want them, we've always sort of, you know, in the era that I've been raised in, we've sort of wanted them to be able to assimilate into our sort of, you know, like wealthier, more Western ways sort of thing. But if we can't allow them into our constitution and recognise that they were the traditional owners of the land, then it's not really a good starting point.
I don't think exclusively no, because I think that we all have a right to be here now and we are all Australian, but I feel that it should be valued as equally, it's as important as other sorts of art.
I do think like a lot to do with Australia is the land, the nature, the different animal species we have, things like that, like just looking at here, there's gum trees and things like that, and a lot of that comes through Aboriginal art more so than it ever could in non-Aboriginal art, just because it's so much part of their identity. So I think it does portray one aspect of Australia extremely well.
If we were to nominate a visual language which most resonated with Australians and which they were most able to sort of kind of, you know, place and say that is kind of representative of something truly uniquely Australian, something that we can't really draw from our kind of European heritage, it would be that.
And I think they represent Australia like more truer than what the rest of the Australian art is like shown.
Do you think Aboriginal art is perceived as equally as contemporary art in Melbourne?
It depends. Like some people, it has a very big market. As people just want to buy it and have it in their house.
I think now, today, there's a greater push for Aboriginal art to be perceived as equal.
I think the problem is largely the arguably parasitic dealer system that has risen around it, and how much of this work is produced and sold in a kind of morally grey area.
Not only is it exploitation, you know, to sort of say, yep, here's a few dots, sell it for 5,000 overseas, they're not going to know the difference. It's not only exploitation, but it's also like a profound, complete disrespect of their culture as well, and it's completely ignorant.
Does the artwork displayed in your gallery have nationalistic elements pertaining to Australia?
Not as a rule, definitely not as a rule. There are exhibitions that explore identity. The Centre for Contemporary Photography is a not-for-profit art gallery in Melbourne, and it sits within sort of in the middle of the sector of art gallery.
Contemporary is a not-for-profit art space in Fitzroy. It began in 1985 as a studio space. The core of the idea of Gertrude is kind of combining a rich exhibition program alongside a kind of mentorship, education-based studio program. We had several shows which were kind of directly kind of questioning and examining Australian identity and how we represent ourselves as Australians.
Do you think larger museums such as the NGV have more of a role in creating national identity than smaller galleries such as Westface and Gertrude Contemporary?
I think in years past, in the 70s and 80s, when perhaps the tradition of artist-run galleries and smaller institutions like ourselves wasn't nearly as strong.
Bigger galleries obviously have a bigger audience, and they have a broader audience in the way that they can attract people who would normally go to an art gallery.
The fact that we have such a strong kind of local art scene, I think, is really now what is building that much more than the NGV.
I don't think that they can do it on their own. I think that it really needs the smaller ones and the experimental ones, the ones where there's no pressure.
What direction do you think art will go in the next 5 years?
I think the internet, it's a cheesy answer, but it will be more and more kind of integral to the practices of people.
A lot of our work doesn't get to the big sort of countries like America and like Europe because we are so far away and so small, and I feel that we're always doing the same sorts of things, and I think we need to change.
This next generation of kids who are kind of 15, 16 now, and 3 or 4 years they're going to start producing real work. For them, broadband internet, video games, streaming music, all that is just opened up before them in a way that we didn't have, and I'm very interested to see how this generation sort of, how they kind of consume information and how that's expressed in their work. I think it's going to be very interesting.
Okay, that's it. Australia is still developing their national identity. Since they were colonized much later than other countries, they are still fairly new and trying to figure out who they are and what they represent. The natural landscape, animal species, graffiti, and Aboriginal art all play a role in Australia's national identity, and they may continue to do so in the future.